This is a very simple introduction to a jig streamer approach versus a fly line tactic. And I get a lot of questions about why do I use a jig streamer approach versus a traditional fly line? And if you're an expert fly fisher and you already know these techniques, then this is not the video for you. But if you're getting into fly fishing and you're hearing a little bit more about fishing a jig streamer on a Euro line, then this could be a video that could maybe help you out. The idea with this is when you're casting a traditional fly line, it doesn't matter if it's a floating line, sink tip, or a fast sinking fly line. If you're making a 35-foot cast with fly line, when you lay 35 feet of fly line on the water, no matter what the sink rate is of the fly line, you've got 35 feet of this large diameter line laying on the water or within the water column. And when current hits that, it's going to drag it. And it's going to move that fly out of the strike zone, and it's going to move it further and faster away from where you want the fly to go. If you're fishing shallower waters, or if the fish are hunting in very shallow waters, maybe it's low light, it could be a rain event where fish are really hunting bait fish along the bank. Using a traditional fly line and fishing your fly maybe 1 or 2 feet below the surface and actively retrieving that fly with a fly line and an active pull with a line hand is going to be a great technique, and it's by far one of my favorites. There's nothing more exciting to me than being able to cast and actively retrieve a large streamer with a fly line and having the fish follow and hail it. But the problem is, or the situation is, those periods where fish are really happy and active and hunting the shallows, it only happens a very small percentage of the time. Just like dry fly fishing, like the moon's only line up so much. Most of the time, the fish are holding in deeper water because they feel more comfortable, or they're resting. And this is where, if you find yourself in conditions where fish are no longer holding in deeper or in shallower water, but holding more likely in deeper water, have an approach where basically you're essentially nymphing, or high stick nymphing, or Euro nymphing, where you're casting upstream, and the rig could be, in this case, an all monofilament system. In this case, it's all 6-pound test monofilament to a small diameter tippet attached to a very heavily weighted fly. And I have a cider colored piece of monofilament that's built as my basically inline indicator in this case. But you're casting all this monofilament out, you're keeping the rod tip high, you're keeping everything basically lifted off the water. The only part that usually ever comes in contact with the water is maybe the last few feet of your line, or in this case the monofilament, where it comes in contact with the surface currents. And when you compare monofilament with a small diameter tippet, it's a fraction of the size versus a very thick fly line that's laying on the water. And as a result, it allows your jig fly to quickly drop down the stream bottom, and it keeps it there. And it doesn't lift it up, and it doesn't speed it up too fast. And it keeps the fly in the strike zone for a much longer extended period of time. I think streamer tactics, a lot of the takes that occur with streamer fishing, I think a lot of it has to do just as much with aggression as it does with hunger. And when fish are not hungry, maybe they fed up the night before, one of the ways to create some sort of reaction is invading their personal space, dropping that fly into their zone, I guess if you want to call it, and keeping it as close to them and as long as possible to encourage them to make some sort of reaction. They may spook, or in some cases, they're going to maybe engage and just strike the fly. And what we are able to do here with this monofilament system is we're going to be able to cast directly upstream, allow this fly to settle. We're just going to slowly work this fly back to us. But it keeps the fly in the strike zone a lot longer for an extended period of time. So this is also true if you have a cold snap. Again, fish are not active, you need to slow things down. This technique is going to work for you. You could also have conditions where you have very low visibility. Maybe the water's turned off color and fish can't see as good as they normally can. And the ability to allow you to hold that streamer in place for an extended period of time is going to give that fish a better opportunity to find and locate that fly during the presentation. So these are some of the things about why the Euro approach with the jig streamer is often far more productive than one that is being used with a traditional fly line, whether it's a floating line, sink tip, or a full sinking fly line. The basic setup is pretty simple. We're going to pretty much off your fly line, which maybe never sees the light of day, which is attached here. In this fly line, I have a 3-way double taper fly line. And I may use this later in the season if there's dry fly opportunities where I'm going to basically take this mono rig off and attach a standard like 9-foot leader to the fly line. But for the purposes of the jig approach, the fly line usually should never see the light of day. Off the fly line loop, I will attach about 35 to 40 feet of a thin monofilament. And in this case, I'm using an 8-pound test Maxima. It's an ultra green, or it could be chameleon. But one of the things I like about the Maxima material, it's got very little stretch. And the rods I'm using, you can use any rod you want, but I tend to use my 10-foot 3-weight Euro rod. These rods are really nice for Euro nymphing, which is what I do most of the time, but also good for dry fly fishing. But you can also jig fish with this. But when you are jig fishing, a lot of times when you're working the fly, and when you set the hook, you're using often the rod tip to help set the hook. And with these longer, limper rods that have a lot of give, what I'm looking for is I want a monofilament that has got virtually no stretch. Because if you're fishing on a monofilament that's got a lot of stretch along with a rod that has a lot of give, when you're setting the hook, you're going to lose a lot of that force. And as a result, I want a monofilament that has got very little stretch. So the moment I lift that rod tip, try to move that fly into the fish's mouth, I'm going to create more force. So I have about 35 to 40 feet of 8-pound test Maxima. And it can be like an ultra green, it can be a chameleon, or even like a high vis green. And off of that, I'm going to have, using a surgeon's knot, I'm going to attach a section of 4X. And normally for the waters I fish, I'm fishing smaller flies. After smaller fish, average fish might be 12 to 16 inches. Rarely do I get 20-inch fish where I fish near my home. So I have about 35 to 40 feet of 8-pound test Maxima. Then off of this, I have a 4X fluorocarbon tip from Scientific Anglers to my heavily weighted jig. The other thing I'm going to do here is somewhere on my tippet, maybe close to where the tippet meets the chameleon or the Maxima, I have a sighter marker. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark this. I'm not using traditional sighters these days. And this is what we call a sighter. When you're nymphing, often this colored piece of monofilament is used as a strike aid. And obviously this will help you see the strikes a little bit more when you're streamer fishing. But in truth, because of this approach where you're fishing a very heavily weighted fly that creates a lot of tension on this line, when fish strike on this jig approach, you're going to feel the strike most of the time. And you don't really need to rely on the visual sight or the sighter to detect the strike. But what I do use this sighter for is to be used as a depth gauge. And like anything else, streamer tactics is a subsurface presentation. Usually with this approach, I'm trying to be close to stream bottom. And if I'm hitting bottom occasionally, and I just notice the height of my sighter, I'm going to hold that sighter off the water a little bit deeper. If I am not hitting the bottom at all, and I'm not catching fish, I'm going to lower my sighter. But basically, this is a tool to kind of help you gauge how deep your fly is in the water column. So I almost always use a sighter when I'm jig fishing, not from a visual strike detection viewpoint, but more from a depth gauge, just knowing how deep my flies are. And the flies I'm using, pretty simple. This is why I can fish this fly on a 3-weight, I can fish this on a 4-weight, but I'm fishing a lot of smaller flies, jig style streamers. They're usually maybe 1.5 inches to 3 inches at the most for where I'm fishing. They're tied on a competition grade hook, jig style hook, which has a very needle-like point. You can buy pre-mold jig hooks, and these are great. I'll use these quite a bit when I'm bass fishing, when I'm fishing really heavy line, and fishing with a much stiffer, stouter tip rod, like say a 6 or a 7 weight, if I'm targeting bass and larger species. The reason why I don't use these hooks, these modeled or pre-molded jig hooks on these big heavy hooks, is because again, the rod tip I'm using is a 3-weight. It's got a very soft tip. These pre-molded jig hooks have a pretty thick gauge wire, and it takes a lot of force to basically penetrate a fish's mouth with this heavy gauge wire, versus these hooks that are competition hooks, but they have like a hook point, like a hypodermic needle. It just requires very little pressure to cinch that fly or the hook point into a fish's mouth. And because of this, because I'm fishing with a rod tip that has a lot of give, I want every advantage possible. So I'm going to stick more with these hooks. And this is a Foley Mills size 8 jig hook. If you try using like a hook like the Wapsi hooks on a Euro rig, it's going to be very difficult. Your hook sets are going to be very poor when trying to do this with a 3-weight rod. So if you're using really soft tip rods, like I do for most of my trout fishing with a jig approach, you're going to want a thinner hook point. But if you're using a stouter rod, heavier line, then you can easily get away with pretty much any jig hook on the market these days. But the hooks and the patterns I'm fishing, I have a couple variations. I have a scalp snack, which is just a variation of a woolly bugger. I've done a bunch of videos on this. And another pattern I like is a Creelix pattern by Chuck Craft. But I just tie these patterns in a couple different color waves. In this case, I have a lot of confidence in olive with my scalp snack, and then what they call a coffee color with the Creelix. Tie this in a couple different sizes, a couple different weights. And the weight is important because often we're using this technique, we're casting upstream. And if the fly is too light, it's not going to anchor itself. And this technique pretty much involves or relies on the fact that the fly is going to be so heavy to the point where once you make a cast upstream, it's going to drop or going to plummet down to the bottom, and it's going to hang up. And what you're doing with the rod tip is just keeping enough tension or hanging the fly under the rod tip and just kind of keeping it hung under the rod tip. If you make a cast and upstream and the fly isn't heavy enough and it's not going to anchor itself, and you start jigging or working the flies and you don't feel a degree of tension within a couple seconds of the presentation, chances are you don't have a fly that's heavy enough. One last thing about patterns is these patterns are not complicated. They shouldn't be complicated. They shouldn't take too long to tie, because this is like a nymphing presentation. You're fishing your flies close to stream bottom, and even though you don't lose too many of these, you will still lose a handful of these flies if you're fishing all day long on a typical situation. So these flies should really not take any more than about 5 minutes to tie. The other thing is you want a fly that is going to drop fairly fast to the bottom. So I don't want a bunch of materials that are just sticking out, protruding out, that's going to decrease the sink rate. I want materials also that are more water-phobic, meaning that they're not going to collect or absorb water. And when you're working this technique, you're thinking about like the fly being more like a soft plastic or something that you can feel it just sliding through the water column. What you don't want is to have the feeling is that when you're working this fly to feel like there's a lot of friction being caused between the fly and the current. And materials like rabbit and wool, if you're using excessive amounts, that's going to collect water, and it's going to feel like you're pulling a wet sock through the water column, and it really loses the sensitivity between rod tip and the fly. So this is why the simple little patterns I use, this is a variation called a scalp snack, simple marabou tail, a polar chenille for the body, and a couple rubber legs. But all the materials shed water pretty nicely, move through the water, glide through the water nice and smooth, quickly plummet to the water column, and also have a lot of movement. So this is why these are some of my favorite patterns. I don't go too crazy. I don't carry 4 or 5 different varieties. Pretty much I fish a couple variations, color variations of scalp snack, a couple color variations of the Creelix, and that's it. And I've talked about this so many times before, but you talk about like live minnow anglers and so forth, like how often does a live minnow angler change the color of his live minnow? They don't. Normally when they're not catching fish with live minnows or baits, what they're doing is they're going to need to change their presentation, even fish deeper or sometimes slower. So I'm a big proponent of changing your technique rather than changing patterns when you're not catching fish. And once you feel like you've cycled through a couple patterns and you feel like you have good technique and you're fishing good water and you're still not catching fish, then definitely maybe a fly change is necessary. But for the most part, when you're not catching fish, usually it's because of how you're fishing a fly when it comes to depth and the speed in which it presents itself to the fish. So what you're going to see next is some on the water footage where I'm just talking about how to make this cast, how to make the cast, how to retrieve the fly. This is an incredibly simple technique and incredibly effective. Again, this is not my favorite thing to do when it comes to streamer tactics. In my opinion, I love casting fly line. I love swimming large streamers and having fish chase them. But again, those conditions and scenarios only happen so often. And when the fish are not chasing, you need to kind of bring the fight to the fish. You need to go deeper, you need to go a little bit slower. And what you're going to see here is just a couple ideas and concepts to allow you to achieve that and hopefully catch a few more fish. So I hope you enjoy this film, the techniques, and some of the things that we talk about. Hopefully it helps you catch a few more fish on your next outing. Take care.
So one of the basic approaches with this technique is about getting the flies down, and think about the angle that you present the flies in relation to the speed and depth that your flies move during the presentation. Meaning that if I'm just trying to speed up my flies, move them as quickly as possible and as high in the water column as possible, we can just simply cast across stream, where I'm casting across the current and sweep the rod tip, and the flies move faster and they stay higher in the water column. But if you have a situation where fish are holding deep, as you have here, slow deep pool, you might have a few fish on the edges, but for the most part, the majority of the fish may be hunkered down right in the depths. We could just simply cast up, let the fly settle a little bit, and then when your fly is going in the same direction and speed as the current, the flies just ride a lot slower and deeper during the presentation. And this is where this technique really works, is just keeping your flies deeper, longer, and slower throughout the presentation. Once the flies settle, and when you're fishing deeper water like this, there might be a couple second countdown, but once the flies are in the strike zone, what we're doing here is just a short little series of just basically little hand and twist retrieve, or you can use a strip. But all I'm doing here with my forearm is just making these very short movements. And when I watch my sighter, that colored piece of monofilament, all I'm looking for is for that sighter just to kind of almost like tense and twitch just a little bit. I don't want to lift it too far off the water, because basically when you're doing this, if I'm lifting that sighter 4 or 5 inches off the water, I'm literally lifting my flies 4 or 5 inches. I'm trying to keep it in the strike zone, and all I'm trying to do is just pulse movement into that fly. So I'm just looking for that sighter to basically stay close or within the water column, and just looking for it to flex and hesitate. Meaning this, what I don't want to do is, once the cast is made, is use these quick wristy upward motions like that where I'm lifting the fly out of the strike zone. Instead, we're going to make a cast, let the fly settle. I may make 1 or 2 long strips to control the drift as it settles, and then all I'm doing here is a combination of a little hand and twist retrieve, and I'm basically just pumping the rod tip just a little bit and just watching that sighter just flex, but I'm not lifting the sighter off the water, giving the flies movement without pulling them out of the strike zone. Pretty basic. And with this situation, when a fish strikes, because of the degree of tension that you're under and how heavy the flies are, you're going to feel the strike. So that sighter that I'm using, I'm not using it as a strike tool. I'm basically using it more as a depth gauge, meaning that if I'm fishing shallower water and I'm hanging up quite a bit, I'm just going to hold that sighter a little higher off the water to keep moving the flies. And if I'm fishing deeper water and I'm not occasionally come in contact with the bottom, I'm just going to let that sighter drop a little deeper before I begin working the flies. So again, the sighter is used more as a depth gauge than it is as an actual strike indicator. But just short pulses, pump, pump, pump. And with this approach, unlike a spinner, where you have to really crank in that line at a fast rate to get that fly to move or create movement and flash, what you can do is you can really slow this presentation down and really pump a lot of movement into that fly while keeping the fly moving at a slow pace. And this is where this technique really, really excels. I can just pump the brakes, pump. I can even take my finger and just send shock waves into that rod tip, down into the fly. And I can get that fly to really move, flash, and hopefully act as an attractor, but keeping that fly nice and slow in the strike zone. In water like this, really skinny, a bit riffly, I'm going to try to burn this. So instead of letting the sighter and the line kind of sweep under and doing a more of a vertical jig, I'm going to be casting and kind of immediately pulling the rod tip downstream along with a hand and twist retrieve. But this puts tension on the rig and swims your flies faster and keeps them higher in the water column. Otherwise, we'd be hanging up. So this is one water type where usually you can burn it. It meaning that you can fish it a lot faster. And a soft edge. Oh man, what a beautiful little brook trout. God, that's awesome. I love that. So fun coming back to these small streams. And with this approach, you can treat this just like a regular fly line or a streamer presentation where you're casting and you can retrieve. Obviously, mono is not as easy to grab onto as fly line, but you can make a cast, you can strip in the line, you can wiggle the rod tip. And there we go. Oops, little brook trout. Have a submerged log. Just gonna do a little flip. Bank shot. Just jig on the other side of that log. Stall it. There's a little wild fish looking at it. Trying to make a decision. It's still on it. Yep, there we go. There we go. But sometimes that dangle and just stalling that fly, you see any sort of flash, anything moving towards your fly, just suspend it, stall it, and you can play cat and mouse, as I did with this beautiful little wild brown trout. Yeah. Thanks, buddy. That's just, doesn't get any better than that.